Well, let's start. I'm Ben Barry, and my job description is Senior Fellow for Land Warfare. But actually, over the last 2 years, I've been doing quite a bit of work on the military implications of climate change, helping both the UK Ministry of Defence and the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is serious stuff. I mean, there may never be another naval war for the next generation, but there's certain to be some negative and a few positive effects of climate change. And you both in Arundel House and joining us online may not necessarily think this is particularly important, but those of you who have children, your children certainly do think this is important. The work we've done in ISS shows that climate change is an accelerator and multiplier of disasters, of instability and conflict. I like to think of it as the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. And it means it's shifting from being just a human security threat to a national security threat to the UK, to its allies and partners across the world. But it also raises the question of how armed forces and wider defence organisations can mitigate climate change by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and contribute to national and international decarbonisation targets. And this is not something that the Royal Navy or any navy of an EU nation can opt out of, because both the UK and the European Union have legislated that they are to achieve net zero by 2050. And one would imagine that government will hold itself to account for that. We've got 4 speakers: Admiral Paul Beattie, the Director of Naval Staff of the Royal Navy, Commander Dr. Andrea Cameron of the US Navy from the US Navy War College, Dr. Matthew Bell from Ernst & Young, and Shiloh Fetzek, who's ISS's Associate Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development. And she genuinely is an expert on climate change. Each of the panelists is going to make give some remarks of 6 or 8 minutes, and then I'll open the topic to discussion, both from people in the room and online. I'm not going to repeat everybody's biographies, as there is the excellent glossy event brochure, but we'll start with Admiral Beattie.
Thanks, right, Ben. Fifth horseman of the apocalypse is a real sort of positive approach to that as we go forward. Well, firstly, thank you for the introduction. I think also great that we're actually talking about this. I mean, I think when you saw this sort of badged in the piece, it almost sounds discretionary. I think, as Ben said, I think the key point I want to get across is that we have no choice but to act. To me, that is really clear for all the points you just highlighted. Firstly, the impact of climate change will increase the demand signal for navies across the spectrum of operations, from military through maritime security to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, while its effects will expand the geographical scope of our activity. Secondly, even if we did choose to bury our heads in the sand and risk the reputational damage of remaining reliant on fossil fuels in the face of a climate crisis, the global energy transition forces us to transform. Otherwise, we'd be left with ships that are unable to operate wherever and whenever the UK government wished them to. The UK, as was mentioned, was among one of the first countries to acknowledge the scale of the climate crisis and the potential implications of our defence and security, to set a legally binding target for greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. And last year, the Ministry of Defence published the Climate Change and Sustainability Strategic Approach, the very catchy CCSSA, acknowledging the need for defence as a major carbon emitter, accounting for 50% of UK's central government emissions, to play its part in helping the UK meet its legal commitment and do its utmost to protect the environment. The strategic approach recognises that defence will face significant costs if it remains tied to fossil fuels, and that its reputation would suffer and its attractiveness to potential recruits would diminish if it diverged from broader UK society. The CCSSA also situates decarbonisation within a broader agenda of innovation and modernisation and a willingness to embrace the green energy transition. Now, while within the UK defence, the Royal Navy is a significant polluter, accounting for approximately 1/3 of emissions. From a global perspective, our Navy is a very, very small energy consumer, and thus our choices are constrained by the future global energy availability. There's thus a tension A tension between a recognized need to act and to act now, while waiting to see which direction the much larger commercial market chooses. For reasons of cost, effectiveness, and interoperability with our allies and partners, future fuel choice is not something we can ever afford to get wrong. But as I said in my introduction, there is no choice other than to act, both to mitigate our impact and to adapt to a climate change world. The IPCC 6th assessment reports this year are indicating that alongside target for net zero by 2050, it is crucial to reduce emissions immediately. And we're seeing countries introduce ever more stringent limits to ships' operations, while possible changes to future legislation and restrictions imposed by other nations could force limitations on our freedom to operate, should we continue to use fossil fuels. In addition, physical changes to the operating environment will limit our capability if we do not adapt our sea, air, and land platforms to operate effectively in such conditions. And the operational demand signal will change. From drought-prone regions experiencing conflict over water rights, to coastal areas facing mass migration, to the Arctic, where melting sea ice clears the way for greater levels of shipping, increased resource extraction, and heightened risk of conflict. And we must expect hurricanes and typhoons to get fiercer, to be more widespread, and the destruction they deliver to intensify in frequency, scale, and scope. And our logistic chains will be impacted with ever more expensive and harder to access heavy diesel supplies. But all of this poses both threat and opportunity. If we can predict the changes to the global security as a result of climate change, we will ensure that we are prepared to respond, and thus we will maintain our freedom to operate and our operational advantage. And while we understand the evolving nature of responding to climate change, we also recognize the need for immediate action to prepare our people to meet the challenges head on, to reduce the impact now in areas where we can, and to adapt our people and platforms to maintain operational effectiveness in this climate change world. This is why the Royal Navy is adopting a three-phase approach: setting the foundation, spreading the cost, horizon scanning to ensure rapid tech update at the appropriate point, and focusing on continuous action rather than overwhelming our people and our industrial partners. Phase one, the build phase, runs from now until 2025. This builds on the pockets of excellence and broad activity already underway to put in place the foundations to ensure the successful delivery of our climate change and sustainability program. We will focus our effort on upskilling and empowering our people to ensure that they consider sustainability in everything they do. We will improve data collection. We will strengthen our collaboration with industry and academia for horizon scanning and identify common programs of work with our partner navies to share knowledge and costs. And we will assess and plan the budget requirements to deliver phases 2 and 3. Phase 2, the initiate phase, will run to 2035. The phase 2 plan will set defined targets and plans for improving sustainability and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in key areas, notably our estate, our operational capability, and procurement. The plan will focus on reducing emissions in the nearer term in line with the recommendations of the IPCC reports. And finally, in phase 3, the accelerate phase, which will run to 2050, with phases 1 and 2 enabling the technical assessments of adapting the available solutions for defense and allocating budgets to achieve this. Phase 3 will evolve around technological developments to ensure the rapid uptake of appropriate technology to further reduce emissions across all scopes. In conclusion, the challenges of mitigating and adapting are significant. And at almost 30 years in length and touching every part of a business, the Climate Change and Sustainability Programme is arguably UK Defence's biggest and most ambitious change programme. But our people are used to change. I mean, as was mentioned this morning, we've done this before: sail to coal, coal to oil, diesel to nuclear. So we know it can be done. But we are at the very beginning of this journey. And while we've already established pockets of excellence, our people have lots of ideas and initiatives, and we have a plan to deliver the changes needed. We will only succeed with the help and partnership of academia, of industry, both defense and the broader maritime commercial industry, and our fellow navies. Thank you.
I am sufficiently impressed that the Royal Navy is not a large consumer of fossil fuels, because I can't stand here as the Department of Defense with the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world. My name is Commander Andrea Cameron. I teach climate change and national security at the U.S. Naval War College. However, today, even though I am involved in the DoD and Navy policy making on climate security, I'm speaking to you more as an academic. So I'll just kind of update you on US policy, where it's at, where it's going, and some of my individual thoughts. So we launched into a drastic initiative on climate change when President Biden first took office. One of his first things he did was issue an executive order looking at climate and security and the intersection of the two. So last fall, so it's been about 15 months where we went from 0 to 100 really, really fast. Last fall, we released the DoD Climate Risk Analysis, which is really the first look at how risk is going to change around the world and the threat assessment based on climate change. And we also released the DoD Climate Adaptation Plan, which set forth lines of effort to reach some of those goals. Each of the services has a climate change strategy coming out. The Army beat everyone to the punch, so theirs came out already, and the Navy and the Air Force will be coming out soon. And within the DoD and across all the services, we have individual climate change working groups that are being stood up. So I'd like to comment a little on what are we working on and what are we doing well, and then go into kind of, Nick wanted to propose this panel to kind of look into, horizon scanning and what we should be thinking about in the future, particularly with respect to naval interests. So what are we doing well? Something we've been doing for decades is looking at our base infrastructure, whether you're looking at energy savings in general or alternative energy. We have really put a lot of effort into our built and natural infrastructure so that we can increase our base resiliency. And we have a lot of political support for that by the bipartisan side in Congress, because everyone has bases in their districts and they want to make sure that they're long-term viable. Another piece that we've been looking at more recently is the alternative energy within particularly operational energy as we deploy. This has gotten a lot of research and development. And as the energy transition continues around the world, this will get a lot more attention, particularly amongst our allies and partners, as well as within the United States. The DoD Climate Risk Analysis was the first attempt really at bringing in some of the risk and threat assessment information out of the intelligence community and our scientific agencies. And that's something we're kind of at the beginning threshold of, is trying to figure out how we take what we know about the science and incorporate it into military operations. You shall see in some of the upcoming strategies, carbon drawdown goals for both the installation energy side and the operational energy side. So now I'd like to include some of my thoughts of kind of where we're going and where the challenges are, because I think those are going to be very similar. So first, we're of course looking at training and equipping for what we call a climate resilience force. And of course, that looks at the mission piece that we're really thinking of, how it's going to affect our platforms, our sensors, and our weapons. So we know things when it comes to ships. We know that our engines are saltwater cooled. So ships already have to slow down in the operational environment. It affects our reverse osmosis and the water supply when we're at sea. And ocean acidification and the heat are going to affect the hulls, the internal systems and sensors. And it's just going to change in general the entire undersea warfare domain. And of course, we're also thinking, naval aviation and above the surface, and how changes in the atmosphere are going to affect our planes as well. So how do we fight in a climate altered world is one of the biggest questions that people in my field are looking at. How do we need to rethink our capabilities, our force structure, and our fleet design in particular? And what new missions might this create for navies around the world? Those are some of the big questions. To do this, of course, one of our biggest lines of effort is what we call climate literacy or climate informed decision making. We're just on the very front edge of figuring this out, just like this group today. If you're not familiar with kind of the intersection of climate and navies, we have to figure out, do we take a top-down approach with our personnel, or bottom-up approach, or hit mid-level leaders that are going to be implementing some of the decisions that are made in the next 10 to 15 years? Who are the people we should be training, and what exactly do they need to know are big questions we're trying to look at the moment. We're looking at our operational plans and planning processes as well, and supply chain resilience, and nothing can be done without looking at acquisition and procurement, and having those kind of priorities that we're looking at aligned with climate change reflected in our programming for the future. Now I have kind of two separate naval thoughts here that I'd like to put forward to you. Many distill climate impacts on navies to, we will have more HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief types of missions. And while that is very logical to think, we've also kind of proposed several other kind of climate impacts and how that's going to affect military forces and naval power. What I'd like to introduce to you is that navies in particular are often the first responders. And if you take together with climate change, some of the science of it, what we will have is these increased frequency of storms, increased intensity. But what we're seeing now is the intensity increases so fast. Within a matter of days, a hurricane can go from category 2 or to category 4, which changes very much how a navy that might be in an area operating would respond to that. And we also see back-to-back storms. So we might be on station already providing humanitarian assistance, and another storm comes right behind it. What we might start seeing, and I really challenge people to think about, is we're no longer going to be able to move our ships fast enough. Standard operating procedure is that you sortie the fleet when a storm comes and you try and get out of the way as far as possible. But we may not have that flexibility. We may be constrained based on how intense and rapid these storms might be hitting us. And finally, I kind of want to, this First Lord said this yesterday, we have lost more ships to storms than to combat. So he was making the point about seamanship and the importance of seamanship. And that I just want to reiterate that if we're facing more extreme weather events, seamanship and naval architecture is going to become even more important to the fleet. My parting thought today, I've heard similar things, and I think my colleagues are going to mention it, so I'll throw it out there. It's one of my key concerns. Energy transition. All countries around the world who are looking at maintaining their own nationally determined contributions to their Paris climate commitments are very rapidly pushing for the energy transition, how they're going to do it as fast as possible. However, another theme we've heard today is interchangeability. So while all of our countries are looking for how to update and get onto alternative energy sources as fast as possible, how do we do that in a way that maintains interchangeability? So I just like to reiterate that with anyone who's listening so that we keep the priority and we keep working collectively as we work towards the energy transition. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I think that point about interchangeability links with a number of remarks that we made this morning, including potentially the value of NATO as a great enabler of military plug and play. Those of you who haven't done much research on climate change may not have come across, but there's excellent research and advisory work out there, keeping the mouse away, published by organizations, including US organizations, but also some of the advisory and consultancy houses. For example, there's very good work published by Lloyd's of London and McKinsey on this topic. And certainly Ernst Young and the other similar companies have a lot of useful advice to offer on adapting to climate change. And we've got Dr. Matthew Bell here from Ernst & Young. Over to you, Matthew. Thanks.
I won't try and wax lyrical. I did want to try and put some context, having heard some of the opening remarks that we've had. You will have heard an awful lot in the context of COP26 and outcomes from the COP in Glasgow just last year. What we do know, apart from the significant changes to the nationally determined contributions that were put forward by 151 countries, is that we are woefully short of our expectations that were set in Paris to try and keep temperatures to within 2 degrees by the end of the century. So we're actually heading way beyond 2 degrees. That is slightly contested by scientists to the degree to which that is going to end by the end of the century, and clearly dictated by how quickly and how rapidly we can decarbonize our economy. But we are talking about a complete decarbonization on a net basis, at least by the midpoint of this century, which means halving our emissions today by 2030. And I say that because this is the most significant change that we're ever going to see in our own lifetimes, in this room at least. Certainly from our perspective at Ernst & Young, we tend to talk about it not just about the most fundamental environmental change that we'll see, but also this most significant economic as well. We're going to need a tripling of the investment in energy markets to decarbonize the current energy infrastructure that we have and move more holistically towards renewable hydrogen and other fuel sources that are less impactful in terms of emissions outputs. But we're also going to need to see investment in all of the industries that are currently emissions intensive so that they decline over a period of time. I specifically used the word net though, because whilst we will be at net zero by the mid-century, if at least all of our policies are followed to exacting measure and added to additionally over the next few years as we head into COPs 27 and 28, they are ramping up now. They will be annual processes. They haven't been historically. And whilst we are seeing change in that sense, we are going to have a significant additional investment to get there. Now, in the context of the Navy and in fact defense more broadly, this impacts in one of three ways. And we've touched on some of those in the earlier talks. The first, of course, is sustainability and resilience of the actual operating environment. How will that change in the context of operations? And that will change fundamentally, both in terms of security of supply of energy to carry out those operations, but also the operating environment that we're working in. So whilst we think about weather impacts and how they're going to change our deployment activities, those same impacts are also going to impact on our people. So one of the things that we see, for example, through the literature is a change in the movement of vectors for disease and warming events. So these become a staffing issue in the context of operating environments that have otherwise been less impactful to our forces, but will be significantly so over the future. The second, of course, is the degree to which we will need to act as a force to respond to the impacts of climate change. Certain climate impacts are baked in. So sea level rises, for example, were we able to switch off all greenhouse gases today, we have a degree of warming that will continue into the oceans, leading to sea level rises that we can't avoid. And that will impact, of course, on port infrastructure, as well as clearly impact on communities that are in low-lying regions and energy infrastructure that also often sits in low-lying regions. But we'll also see an increase in conflict associated with scarcity of resources. Only the resources have moved from fossil fuel resources to natural resources, such as access to water. Unfortunately, the good and the bad of climate change is that it doesn't play out universally globally. So whilst we're actually today at around 1.2 to 1.4 degrees of warming towards that 2 degrees that we're trying to keep within by the end of the century, just to put that in context, we are significantly moved towards that 2 degrees. So whilst we have moved that far ahead, we see warming way above 1.2 degrees in some parts of the world and significantly lower in others. We've talked about things like cyclonic and hurricane events, which in some areas will increase in terms of their impact, and in others, they will increase in impact but reduce in severity, reduce in consistency that we see, and they'll change their pattern of where they impact. Water as well, scarcity in some regions, deluge in others. We've seen that play out pretty fundamentally in Australia in the last 18 months, where we've gone from bushfires around the same time of year that a following year we've had 14.5-meter floods wiping out whole villages. So the impacts of climate change are pretty profound, and they are, as I say, impacting in three areas. The last of which is the one that we talk about a lot, and that's decarbonizing our own operations. So how is it that we ensure that our own emissions, whether you're an organization that produces steel, manufactures equipment for the force or the force themselves, how do you reduce your own emissions in a way which is consistent with this decarbonization pathway out to 2050? Now, again, in the UK, whilst we have legislative mandates in place, even getting those right from the 150 countries who have made those commitments towards net zero won't actually get us to the point at which we'll be at 2 degrees of warming. And I should make this other point, if I'm not scared you enough in the room already, that when we talk about trying to achieve 1.5 degrees that you'll read in the press an awful lot, which is our global aspiration of where we would wish to be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And 2 degrees, as I say, is the Paris outcome that was lauded when it was released. When we talk about those targets, it's actually a 50% likelihood of us achieving those targets by the end of the century. And actually, we have the same potential risk of achieving a far worse outcome by the end of the century as we do of achieving 1.5 degrees. Statistically, we are as likely to hit 6 degrees of warming by the end of the century if we don't continue to rapidly decarbonize our economy as we do 1.5 degrees. To put that in context, and I don't share this normally with business groups when I talk about climate risk, but I will with you. To put that in context, at 6 degrees of warming, the carrying capacity for humans on Earth is 1 billion people. So we're in a profound environment where we will see the Navy impacted in 3 ways, each of which are going to impact not only in your operations, but they will on your procurement, and they will on the way in which you need to manage the force over the coming years and into the future. So I look forward to a discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Matthew. And now I'll call across upon Shiloh Fetzek from our Conflict Security and Development Programme, where certainly over the last couple of years, we've been seeing the negative effects of climate change in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. Over to you, Shiloh.
Thanks so much, Ben, and it's great to be with you here. I'm going to offer some broader perspective on how the climate issue is moving generally, what that means for security planning for the mid-century, and how this can help to make some of these difficult decisions for navies. First, Dr. Bell has already emphasized where we're at in terms of the science and how serious that is. I would complement the kind of ringing of the alarm bell by noting how the climate politics are moving right now. So there's a lot of tension that's escalating between countries that are most impacted and that are most responsible for this. And these trends, in the context of a really slim margin to avoid runaway climate change, is, I think, a perhaps underappreciated aspect of the climate security nexus. What is this realistically going to look like for planning for 2040, 2050s? And I lead with that partly to indicate about that risk picture, but also because it has, again, a bearing on many of the naval-specific questions around partnerships, around alliances and relationships, especially with many of the countries that have massive maritime domains that are incredibly vulnerable to climate change. How will grievances play into those relationships? Mission sets have already been mentioned about the potential for hater diplomacy. And earlier we spoke about maritime security issues around resources. The climate change features heavily in the larger picture of geostrategic competition and preserving the rules-based international order. There's another component, again, which Dr. Bell spoke to a bit, actually all the previous speakers, around what the energy budget for defense is going to be. And I would like to raise as well the politics of making space for defense emissions. So with that in mind, I think I'll speak a bit more to the broader and longer term strategic implications. The future is becoming much clearer on the risk landscape. A fundamental reshaping of power and resource dynamics is ahead of us, particularly when it comes to energy suppliers, and the decline of hydrocarbon-based economies over the medium term, which itself could create some instability in these countries, price volatility, and supply chain vulnerabilities that affect defense users, amongst others. The part of the context as well is in which the geostrategic competition for allies and partners will happen includes around climate action. And I think China as a key adversary has a very different history and approach to its narrative on climate action. I think the UK is doing a lot to catch up in terms of demonstrating itself as a committed partner, but I think that will feature again in competition for allies and partners. We've already spoken a bit about how climate change can feature in driving fragility and instability, but what I would emphasize is that what we need to really look for, I think, are these feedback dynamics and compounding dynamics, both in the political space and in the security space as well. And this is increasingly addressed in defense strategies very prominently in the UK, and I expect many here are broadly familiar with the contours of this issue. But at the same time as the risk picture is increasing, we also are improving our capacity for foresight on this. Data analytics and modeling around climate and environmental security is getting much better. And we're able to understand and predict where fragility and instability might emerge based on climate projections using AI tools and other types of monitoring situations on the ground. In fact, the Germans have just announced that they're going to make this issue a keystone of their upcoming G7 presidency. So the picture on disruptions and awareness in that sense is becoming a lot clearer. But here I think it links again with the politics of this issue, and that then it becomes a matter of capacity and being able to respond. And of course, as anyone who works in HATER knows, there's a competition between kind of the warfighting element and the HATER capacities. And that's, I think, where the politics of resource distribution and the level of response becomes perhaps a little bit more tricky. So let's speak a bit more about implications for navies. HATER's been addressed earlier. We talked about some of the personnel and manpower issues, and I wonder, would posit this as the case, and I'd be interested to hear Dr. Cameron's take and others on this, around whether thinking again 2, 3, 4 decades down the line in the lifetime of the capabilities that are being procured now, whether it makes sense to spin out HATER capabilities as a separate force so that you're not necessarily using war fighters for those capabilities, recognizing, of course, that there is an element of strategic advantage around building relationships in that context. How climate change impacts maritime security has also been mentioned, perhaps a bit tangentially, but the impact of the ocean on the oceans is profound in terms of resource issues, and IUU fishing has come up, piracy, issues around EEZs, and that all points to the need for more sophisticated domain awareness. And here I think that again highlights the potential role for dual and multi-use capabilities that on the one hand can monitor scientific, environmental, and climate change changes, as well as monitoring presence and activities in the maritime domain. The need for consistency around alliances and partnerships was mentioned earlier. Obviously, there's a range and breadth of mission requirements that will come into play in that in a climate change future, as well as an increased level of demand. And it really makes the argument for better integration and coherence and interoperability with partners that are further afield, a point that came up earlier, which I would re-emphasize. I wonder if there might be a case for sharing and trading military emissions budgets within this context as well. Not a topic that I think has been discussed at much length yet. So lastly, I would say in terms of the implications for navies, part of the pacing for making these changes that have been described is also about the share of the carbon budget of any country that defense has. And really that's a question of prioritization and a national conversation that's going to happen around that. And I think that too might press on some internal social and political divisions. And there's a real need, I think, for a better understanding of the role and need of defense in a climate change future for ensuring peace and prosperity. Navies, of course, having a critical role in that. And I think here good communication on the nature of climate risk and the nature of defense in addressing it is really important. And I think Secretary Austin and Deputy Secretary Hicks in the US have really done an exemplary job of articulating the nature of the threat, defense's commitment to addressing it. So I think it's critical to approach these difficult decisions around future naval planning, mindful of some of these aspects of the politics of these questions, as well as the potential positives and the ability to support allies and partners in climate sensitive regions, given as well the precarity, I think, of where we're at in terms of what the science says, and in light of the fraying politics for climate action to address this and what this means for security in the mid-century. Oh, and there.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. Well, we've now got an opportunity for questions and comments from the floor and also from the audience at home, and or in their office or in their car or wherever they happen to be. And I've got to about 3 questions already from the floor, but I'm going to start with someone through cyberspace, who's that well-known delegate, anonymous attendee. And what he or she is saying is, in reference to achieving net zero emissions, is the Royal Navy considering nuclear power systems on board future vessels? So perhaps if I just park that for Admiral Beattie and maybe.
I'm happy to answer that now.
Okay.
Rolls Royce in the room. So.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
I think the key in terms of R&D and look at this is nothing's off the table. I think we've got to be really clear about that. I think, you know, when we talk particularly about, you know, it came out in everybody's piece about the big decision for NATO in terms of fuel changing. I think we want to eliminate things that could be a potential solution. I think you've just got to, with nuclear, look at across entire nuclear domain. What is the carbon footprint that goes with the construction piece? It is not a zero piece in terms of construction. It's actually quite a large piece. So I don't think it's off the table. I do think it's an option that we need to consider, and we are doing somewhat to look at what the potential could be.
Thanks. Andrew, have you got anything to add from the perspective of the biggest nuclear navy in the world?
Well, we did have nuclear powered cruisers for quite a while and got rid of them. However, the technology has advanced so much in the nuclear space, and the scalability, you know, bringing it back down to size, makes it much more a plausible option again in the future.
Can I just press you on that, though, Admiral? We have heard that, that there's a nuclear skills issue. You know, the 8 years to generate a nuclear watchkeeper, and I have occasionally come across indications that the nuclear industry as a whole in the UK is limited by that skills issue. Would it be realistic to actually have a more nuclear Royal Navy in the UK from the skills point of view?
The skills piece is a challenge. There'll be many other challenges if we chose that. But I think if we committed to that in a time frame in the sort of 2040s, that would give you time to build the skills that you would need to take that forward. I mean, obviously Rolls-Royce have a commercial piece that's about to go on the market. They're looking at taking that forward. So it's a challenge, but I don't think it eliminates it.
Well, thank you very much for being so candid with us. There's a gentleman just there on the aisle, and then I'll group him together with a couple more people, I think.
Very, very short, very to the point. We talked a lot
Sorry,
about.
could you just say who you are?
Oh, certainly. I'm James Sproul. I'm an honorary captain in the Navy, but I'm also former naval officer, but now chief economist in the city. Looking at one of the issues you talked about has been the whole critical issue of obviously carbon reduction. But even if the Navy was as good as it possibly could be, the gains on a global basis are relatively moderate. One of the areas, however, I think the Navy could be making a much bigger impact is on protecting fisheries, which is clearly one of the areas where we have following a completely unsustainable path. And I wonder if there was perhaps more emphasis on that, because that's where we could make a bigger impact. Also in the city, one of the big trends right now is towards ESG. I think the Navy needs to actually push back a bit on this, because right now we're in danger of having all defense put outside the ESG envelope, and that's increasingly gathering a lot of financing.
Would you mind just decoding ESG for
ESG is environmental and social and governance, and it's a way of investing that any company that doesn't meet these standards, and by definition, certainly under the EU taxonomy that's being debated right now, defense companies will not be able to meet this regardless of whatever else they do. So it's becoming a real problem, and it means that the financing for a lot of defense companies is becoming far more expensive as a result. And I think there needs to be a pushback from the military to say, actually, having a long-term viable way of deterrence is itself incredibly important for sustainability. So I think there needs to be a bit of a pushback on that, because otherwise you're in danger of actually being cornered into something that's really quite undesirable.
You had 3 points.
The third point was one of the things that it struck me when the Admiral was speaking is that we've got a real balance between trading off capability against the environmental goals. And I wonder, how does that work with a lot of military things? Because obviously in a business, we can look at broader objectives and the costs and the capabilities. But for the military, those capabilities can be so absolutely critical, obviously life and death in many cases, and that trade-off is that much more difficult as a result.
Well, three excellent questions from the point of view of the city. So I'll bundle them together. And actually, can I start with you, Matthew, on the ESG or any other points you want to?
Yeah, happy to. So it's a really good point around the EU's taxonomy in the context of ESG. It's a fair comment, actually. I mean, I think it is increasingly looking likely that the EU is pushing in the direction of excluding defence broadly from its taxonomy in the context of sustainable finance, which will impact both on banking, but also on central financing from the member states themselves. I would probably argue that the panel in its entirety, both US and UK, has limited capability to push back on the EU in the context of taxonomy, given where we sit politically and separated. But I would say that rather than pushing back, I actually think it's around telling the story in the context of sustainability and having a story to tell. So I touched on the role that the Navy will play from a humanitarian perspective. I know this is very true in the context of the US and its disclosures around expectations on deployment. We know that humanitarian crises are going to dramatically increase due to climate risk. And so the defense will play a very key role, arguably the most important role globally to support nations as they go through these crises. That is one element clearly of ESG. More broadly, though, I think taking responsibility for environmental management, for the impacts on societies, both positive and negative, and the governance that is in place, both from the organizations that support defense and defense themselves, is a fundamental obligation. And I don't think we're at a point anymore where a lack of transparency is either encouraged or frankly real. We are in a point of aggressive transparency. There are no secrets anymore, despite how we'd like to keep them. So I would challenge that pushing back is going to be very hard.
Charlotte, have you anything to add on this?
I agree wholeheartedly on the importance of fishing enforcement. Also because of the implications of China's rule breaking and its long-range fishing fleet and the critical impact that has on countries in the Pacific that are basically like oil economies, except with tuna. So I think it's a lot, you'll know, it's a lot easier to prevent rule breaking than try and catch up later. And I think that there should be much greater emphasis on, again, maritime domain awareness being a key part of understanding who's exploiting resources where, and making a clear signal in places, including the Gulf of Guinea and elsewhere, that there will be some pushback on it.
Thanks. Paul?
I think I'll focus on this sort of trade net capability because I don't think that's what we intend to do. I think we adapt so that we are capable, and that's why it has to be faced. We're not talking about paying off carriers because there are emissions. We're talking about replacement platforms being adapted and taking this into account so that they can be used in the future.
Can I just ask you a supplementary here?
Yeah.
How much is the Navy looking at investing in carbon capture? Because of course net zero doesn't stop you being an emitter if you've built up your carbon capture capability.
Very early stages. Yeah, it's part of our plan to look at it, but we've done not much more than that.
Okay, thanks. Andrew?
I just wanted to comment on the fisheries. So in the United States, it's actually the Coast Guard that is responsible for IUU fishing around the world, and not the Navy. However, so the US Coast Guard is partnering because it is primarily a naval responsibility in almost every other country, which is really interesting and potentially a gap as it continues to be something that's on the threshold of competition, state-to-state competition in particular.
Of course, fish have a vote because as the temperature changes, they'll move around, which will be yet another thing to add to the bill of topics that are essential for maritime domain awareness. I think I saw a question, Caroline Emmett, over on the side.
Hi, Caroline Emmett. I'm CGS's fellow here at IISS. And my question is specifically about greening defence within the timeframe of 2025, so forward. The next integrated review, or whatever we're calling it, proposition. So by that stage, we already know that the RAF, Chief of the Air Staff, has already talked about using estates to decarbonize. They're also doing research and experimentation in terms of alternative fuels, propulsion. This week, the British Army released their battlefield electrification approach, which is another way at getting after net zero, whilst also providing operational advantage. Seems to me, dare I say it, that along with it is interrelated with autonomous and autonomy. Where's the Navy? Where will the Navy be by 2025? Because according to your plan, as I see it, sir, is you'll just be finishing the understand stage, so almost like a bound behind the other two services. And I wondered whether you were a little bit concerned about that.
I think the key is that we've got to get this right, and you know, and the thing is, we're doing this in partnership with the other services. So all the changes that the Army are focusing on the estates are being delivered to the Navy and the Air Force estates as well. So we're taking that knowledge and that expertise. The Air Force and the focus on synthetic fuels is appropriate for them. It's less appropriate for us. And I think, you know, I think in some ways our challenge is bigger because how long our platform is in service, how long it takes from concept through to delivery. You know, Type 31 will be in service probably 60 years from now. So we've got to get this right. And I think I would say what we're doing is perhaps more sophisticated, perhaps more subtle, which is in some areas we will be innovative. You know, things like electric boats and dockyards, we could drive that forward quite quickly. In some areas I've talked about, particularly that fuel piece, we've got to get right and we've got to take the time. And as has been said, it's not a decision for the UK alone. We've got to do this with partners and get that right. I think it's a more difficult piece.
Thanks for that. I mean, it does strike me also that in terms of nuclear, you do have an opportunity that it's difficult to see the Army or the Air Force being able to exploit to the
Well,
same
although the
extent.
US are doing some work on potentially nuclear for basic, so
Yeah.
there are options.
Andrew, have you got anything to add on this?
Well, I just would add, particularly our in the US, the planning and budgeting cycle. So to do anything by 2025, you'd probably have it on the books already, and then we don't. So we in general are looking 2030 for most of our kind of forward projection and actual tangible things, kind of the latter half of this decade.
Matthew, have you got anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I think it's a really interesting point. The planning to enable decarbonisation is fundamentally required and really needs to be well thought through because of the long lead times of defence. And I think sometimes that's mistaken for. I mean, there's a big difference between estates and you know, and vessels, for example. And so, you know, like any activity. So if you were doing this for a large industrial organization, you would go through the same process, right? What are all the various options that you have available to create efficiency in the current activities, to look at your procurement supply chain, work with your suppliers, as we know the Navy are, to ensure that that pipeline of decarbonized manufactured goods come to you, and make the right investments, as we said, in things like offsets and even direct air capture, because I think, unfortunately, there is no one silver bullet. I mean, that's what we're learning, is that we need to do everything, and you need to optimize the deployment of capital to make sure that you're doing that in the right way.
Thanks. Gentleman here on the aisle again.
Good afternoon, Jamie Black from Circuit Defence. I've got two linked themes, which I'm rather hoping the panel can give some assurance on, but I rather suspect you can't. The first is, are we in danger in our decarbonisation efforts of exchanging one potentially difficult supplier in the form of Russia for another potentially very difficult supplier in the form of China, in terms of our attempts to go down an electrification route, not least because they currently control around 80% of the rare earth market globally, and that doesn't look like it's going to change significantly in the near future. Linked with that, and it perhaps is an aspiration for joined up government, that again I suspect will probably be disappointing, in its realization is the one thing that is always a restriction when it comes to these aspirations is that inevitably, sort of when D&S are tasked to procure the said service good or whatever it happens to be, cost always crawls quite high up the list of priorities, and we see a disconnect between the aspiration and the policy and the delivery, the actuality of the delivery, and we're seeing that certainly in some aspects of the National Shipbuilding Strategy, for example, at the moment. So how will we get over the fact that a decarbonised economy is going to be a more expensive economy for defence?
Thanks for that. That's another question that sort of centre of gravity is the UK. So I'll ask the Admiral to go last.
Thank you.
Andrea, have you got anything to add on that, particularly the business of China having potentially seized the commanding heights of the rare earth sector globally?
I think that's a fair question. And if you're looking kind of, we've talked geostrategically quite a bit today. If you're looking at that, you need to be thinking and looking at supply chain of those elements and how important they are if we are to achieve our own goals, and to either develop markets that are within our allies and partners' borders, and so that we're less reliant on that, because they do hold such a monopoly on the entire supply chain from production, extraction through production.
Matthew, Charlotte, have you anything you want to add on this one?
Yeah, just to note a couple of initiatives to that end on the US side. The president recently activated the Defense Production Act in light of the costs of some of the critical minerals for batteries having gone up so substantially because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think nickel had gone up some 700% or something like that. And there's also groupings such as a Canadian-US initiative around securing supply chain for those minerals as well, given Canada's mining expertise in various contexts globally. So there are attempts to address it. Unfortunately, you know, those are simply the numbers that we're up against, but absolutely it's a strategic vulnerability and we've walked kind of straight into it.
I actually think they're both brilliant questions, so well done for both of those. I'll come back if I can to the rare earths minerals that underpin and China's role in that, because I think that's really interesting. But I actually wouldn't mind reevaluating. You made a comment around the capability of potentially some interoperability or an emissions trading model between defense forces. I think so. Again, in the commercial sector, what we are seeing is we've seen a move from shadow pricing for carbon that has been put in largely to increase the hurdle rate around certain activities that might not be economically advantageous over the midterm, to much more sophisticated models now of almost internal emissions trading schemes within organizations, largely multinational organizations that operate across a few different business models. You know, not that I could talk to them, unfortunately, but large resource companies, for example, that operate in multiple commodities. How do they optimize the way in which that they reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but don't penalize everybody or make it more expensive than it need be? The short answer is you have an emissions trading model inside your own company, whereby if it's cheaper for you to pay another business unit to reduce their emissions than it is to reduce your own, you do that in the first instance. So you kind of get the lowest cost of abatement inside a company in the same way that we've seen the lowest cost of abatement in Europe under the EU ETS, as an example. But so I'm fascinated as to whether or not that would work in the context of defense and maybe even within our allied forces. But I would say the other part here, and we touched on China. So again, for context, China produces more electric vehicles today than the rest of the world combined. They also sell more electric vehicles to Chinese people than the rest of the world combined, just to give some scale to it, because I think we forget the scale of China sometimes. And they have made early and very poor economic decisions, you might have argued 15 years ago, to start to exploit some of the rare minerals and lithium, cobalt, copper, etc. that they have. The good news, we've touched on Canada, but the good news is we know that there are mineral reserves in other parts of the world, many areas of which sit within allied nations. So we've touched on Canada, but clearly Australia as well, which I was in for the last 15 years, has significant reserves of rare earths, as well as lithium and other other commodities that are going to be required in the sort of the new world of electrification of everything. So I think we've seen early investment from China. I think we'll probably see, the investment move to other nations and probably differential investment, even if there is a price difference for those nations, if we want to ensure that we're not aggregating all of our supply around China.
Thanks, Matthew. I think that illustrates a point in the integrated review that China is a nation that the UK and the international community have to collaborate with as much as they might confront and have uncomfortable conversations, because China and India, both in the Indo-Pacific, are such important emitters that can't be ignored. I think the other point you make illustrates some points that's come out of work that we did for the Ministry of Defence, in that within any organisation that's going to make this transition, there are going to be some people who are made uncomfortable, and there are going to be groups internally that are both disadvantaged and advantaged. Now, that's a classic change management thing, but what it does mean is within the organisation, there needs to be a clear baselining and a database. And that database of emissions needs to be transparent within the organisation so that decisions can be made in the best informed way. And they can also be justified internally. And some of those conversations may have to be pretty far reaching with some hard choices to be made. And on that, I'll pass to the person who's
So I'll focus on your money one. I think so. You're not yet there, but Defence is working on how do you capture the sustainability impact on all future procurements. I think within the next few months we'll have real clarity on what that will look like. So I think this will become a significant factor and hopefully resolves that worry that you had that we go to the cheapest rather than actually the most sustainable option.
Thanks. There's a question in the middle of the left-hand side.
So my name is AP George Flynn. I'm on board HMS Prince of Wales at the moment. I'm a meteorologist and I'm one of the future maritime strategists. So my question largely comes down to, obviously we live in climate change world at the moment. We see obviously sea levels rising, the Arctic Circle retreating year after year. And we also see increasing shipping lanes open, which obviously means new tactical areas we might not have previously thought of. Obviously, HMS Prince of Wales has recently conducted cold response and cold weather trials. Does the RN have any, further thought into how to deal with these new emerging shipping lanes and new tactical areas? Thank you.
Thanks, and it's great to hear from meteorologists. And meteorology is one of the UK's international strengths on this, with the Met Office and the Hadley Centre.
I don't know if we're going to answer your question or we can come back with it. I mean, I clearly, in our strategy and in the integrated review, it was very clear that we saw, the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific would be areas that would be operating more in the future, areas that, are heavily affected by climate change. Our understanding of those areas continues to increase, and we're focused on doing that. So we'll build that expertise, but a lot of that, of course, involves partnering with the nations that are close to that, the Canadians, the Americans, the Norwegians, to understand, their own backyard, and for us to have that data and information.
Andrew, have you got?
So in the United States, it's another place where primarily the Coast Guard is present in the Arctic and not the Navy. It is a significant area that we're starting to think about, particularly all the different ways we need to winterize, not just the hulls, but also our sensors and our ships and our communications and the people. If you're going to put them in that kind of extreme cold environment, how do you make sure that all of those systems are working? There's a lot of cooperation, particularly with search and rescue, and I imagine those types of missions continuing. We have recently restood up the Second Fleet, and I think it's kind of an open question in the United States right now, how much that might have an Arctic presence.
Right. Although, of course, it's an inconvenient truth that climate change means the high north is becoming less Arctic. So do you not see that those specialist Arctic capabilities might actually diminish in importance over time?
I think in general, it's melting.
Yeah.
However, it's still going to be a very harsh, cold operating environment. I mean, it's not like it'll be warmer seas or anything that we'll have to be working about. It will be accessible.
Yeah.
However, I think still the cold weather implications are going to be profound for least looking out, we'll ask Matt that question. How
Matthew, Charlotte, anything-
2100 at least.
anything to add?
The winters are still going to be dark and very hospitable. So maybe the summer capabilities might diminish in some importance, but certainly not in the winter months.
I definitely don't want to answer this with a meteorologist in the room who's going to show me up dramatically. I mean, the short answer is, as we know, it plays out really differently in different locations. I mean, even the Arctic and the Antarctic, for example, and where we're seeing expansion and retreat of ice. But I think the point remains the same, though. This sort of strategic need to consider long-term how your operations are going to fundamentally change, both in the context of why you're there, but also how you operate when you're on. And I really like the people perspective of this too, because it's the oft forgotten part of this, that actually the environments are going to be more challenging in areas and less so in others for the people operating.
We've got another question online from someone called Jamie Roylance. And I'll just read it to you. Last September, a team from Oxford University's Institute New Economic Thinking published a paper which forecast that a rapid green energy transition will likely result in overall net savings of many trillions of dollars, even without accounting for climate change or the co-benefits of climate policy. What do the panel make of this? And if this point has merit, isn't there a need for being more ambitious timelines if we, the UK and its allies, are to grasp the opportunities as well as addressing the challenges of climate change? Can I start with you, Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, that argument is definitely there. Like, while there are costs of making this transition, the savings once you have are considerable. I think obviously in a post-Ukraine invasion context as well, it's really sharpened the mind about the strategic vulnerabilities of relying on the energy systems that we've had. That particular study and the cost numbers involved in it, I can't really speak to it, having not read it, but you know, the argument has been the same for a long time, and it remains as effective as it was when it was first published.
The challenge with this, almost any reputable economist will tell you exactly the same thing, right? So the benefits economically at a global scale of us taking early action on climate change far outweigh by multiples the consequence of us not. The problem, though, of that is that the benefits and the costs are received and borne by different people. You know, we had a great question, right? In the context of how do we factor in the additional costs of climate change? We actually already have the additional costs of climate change. They're unfortunately just usually paid for by defense, by government, and therefore by the taxpaying base that underpins that, rather than necessarily the organizations who are close to or proximal to the issues themselves. So the challenge of that is, in order for us to make that early action, it doesn't change the fact that we need to see rapid and vast amounts of capital deployed to achieve that rapid transition. The benefits of that transition are then felt by societies globally. And so that, you know, this is the inertia of our capital markets, unfortunately.
Thanks. Andrew?
Well, you framed this earlier as a change management issue.
Yeah.
So not only do you have to get the general population to change their behavior to make this happen, but there's so many entrenched interests kind of working against it. So if we had kind of all-in buy-in that we wanted to do this rapid, we would see those kind of economic benefits, but that's just kind of not the full reality of the current energy economic system.
I think for defence, Andrew sort of hit the nail on the head earlier on. It's the budget cycle would make this really difficult. You'd have to drive out many of the things that we've talked about throughout today in order to do this quicker. And that doesn't feel like the right answer when we get back to the capabilities we're on.
Thanks. Are there any other questions, both online and from the floor? Okay, I've got a couple more. There's a lady in green, I think.
Yeah, just to follow on, was it Caroline? From Caroline's question. I'm at the Freeman Air and Space Power Institute. I'm also chair of the Learning Society Board at the Royal Aeronautical Society. So I'm coming from a slight air perspective and being quite familiar with the RAF's plans. And I would acknowledge they are skeleton, but ambitious. Much of the motivation I see for that is actually, and this is discussed a lot in the Aeronautical Society, with commercial aviation business and industries, is winning the battle for the best people and attracting those young people who are going to look and are looking at the sustainability commitments of the organisations they might want to work for. And it is often a primary motivator. I mean, do you feel, I don't want to sort of say, do you feel uncomfortable, but it's a big competition. And I think aviation and the Air Force to an extent have realised that quite early on and are making quite a loud noise, and there's a lot of discussion. Are there similar discussions with maritime industry, yourselves, others, about how you present a sort of united front in appealing with your sustainability credentials?
I wonder if I could take that question, and then I think the First Sea Lord would like to join the conversation. So should we take the question?
I think on talent, yeah. I tried to cover that in my remarks. Is that's one of the reasons why we've got to do this. Yeah, it's sort of unacceptable. The people that join the Navy today expect us to do everything to reduce our emissions and to take part and try and drive this forward. So I think in terms of that drive for talent, we completely acknowledge that. I think, as I said, we've sort of covered before, the difference between the aviation and the shipping industry is the aviation industry is sort of aligned on what the answer is. The shipping industry isn't. We don't know what the technological solution is here. So we're just a little bit behind. And we've got to crack that piece first before I think we can align behind that and then drive that forward.
And the propulsion systems are so much larger scale. And a lot of aviation, a lot of the technology developments, you don't have to change the system, you're changing the fuel that goes through the system. And I don't think that's been resolved on a maritime level, either civilian or military at the moment. In general, I like the competition for talent. I do agree with the younger generation. They're called to serve. That's one of the reasons I kind of like some of the humanitarian and development missions that the military does. And climate fits into that. So it's kind of appealing to a lot of different values that we might see in the younger generation.
Matthew, anything to add?
Well, I mean, I've got 2,300 people in my team. Their average age is 26 years old. And so quite clearly sitting in the climate practice, they are engaged in that topic. But the only reason we can keep those people on our teams is if we're able to demonstrate that the actions we are taking are creating impact. And I think that's the same for all organizations, frankly, whether they are defense or commercial. There is a change agenda that has occurred, ironically, from the investor community that has now infiltrated the workforce, and whether there has been significant change in their mentalities post-COVID, I don't know, but we have never heard so many questions from all of our people across EY. So we employ 340,000 people globally, as to the importance of us personally taking action. And I hadn't heard that before in the last couple of years. So I couldn't see why that wouldn't translate to others as well.
Charlotte.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody, well, not that young, I guess, but it's the fuel for the fire, I think, is not going to diminish in any way. Ben and I have talked about Extinction Rebellion before and the impact that they've had on the overall political environment, even though most of the climate movement considers them to be quite fringe. This, I think, too, it ties a bit with the kind of the grievance and the narratives that exist around climate risk and climate vulnerability, and the way that those have caught on and evolved and are now shaping climate politics, which I mentioned earlier. As you may be aware, there was a reference to colonialism in the IPCC report that climate vulnerability is a consequence of that. And I think that, as these impacts ramp up, this is going to continue to kind of solidify and form perhaps part of the widening divisions that we might see within society. Although I think the climate issue, you will hear Republicans in the US say, if you don't have a climate platform, you're not going to get the younger vote. So it does span the political spectrum, but at the same time, I think there will be some narratives that can also emphasize divisions within that.
First Sea Lord, so this is your conference, of course.
Thanks very much, Ben. Probably a question rather less for Paul Beattie and more for the other panelists. We clearly, and that's just to let him off the hook, I think. We clearly have an obligation to make sure that we are not a net contributor to the challenges of global warming, and I understand that, and we've got a long journey to go on that. What I'm interested in from the panelists, from what you've seen or heard, either today or more broadly, about how navies are responding to the challenges of either policing the impact of climate change, or dare I say it, even potentially having to police climate change behaviors in the future. What is it you think we should be preparing for most and making sure we've actually got docked into our plans? And is that what we seem to be preparing for most, or if not, what's the gap we're going to have to close? Because everything I've heard described now is that this is going to be one of those things which affect human behaviors increasingly over the coming decades, and governments will turn to their militaries to play a part in it. And part of my fear is that we may not actually be best set to respond when that moment comes, as opposed to the things we understand about our task list today already.
Well, thank you. That's a seriously useful question, April. Thanks very much. I'll start with Shiloh from IISS.
Sure. I think just kind of a general breakdown of social order is to be expected, and a lot more kind of chaos and low-level conflict, very diffuse and very self-reinforcing as well in the areas of the world that are most impacted and most vulnerable to climate change. I think a deterioration of the security environment such that some areas are really going to struggle to even pull out of it. And I say areas, and I think I really mean, much of the Sahel, much of the Horn, Afghanistan and its environs. I think that we're going to see really difficult situations to rectify. And those are obviously not necessarily areas that have a huge impact on the maritime domain, but I think the spillover in terms of impacts in the Gulf of Guinea or Somalia and its environs as well. I think there's going to be a much bigger challenge to maintain some of the rules-based international order has come up. I think that's level of kind of difficulty happening in a number of different domains will be challenging to keep up with. Let's see, I may have lost my train of thought, pardon my jet lag. I'll maybe turn over to you.
I think it's a really interesting question. And I think if we were to parallel it with geopolitical conflict, so in many ways, defense and arguably specifically the Navy plays an incredibly strategic role in terms of predicting, understanding, and strategically thinking through a response to geopolitics that will play out fundamentally and impact nations, and therefore the role that the defense will play. I see no reason why that wouldn't be entirely the same case in the context of climate change. And if that's the case, then you would ask yourself, how do we prepare ourselves incredibly well to be ahead of the game? Whether that's war games or strategic planning that goes in place, that puts scenarios in place around different potential outcomes that might exist. I mean, we've heard, the sort of prophetic outcomes that could exist from some books out in the marketplace at the moment around the worst impacts of climate change. For example, nations seeking to secure biological assets that are so fundamentally important internationally, that China would take a position to secure the Amazon, for example. Now, some of those seem far-fetched, but if you look at the science, they potentially aren't. What I would say is we are in an incredible position with climate change in that we know far more about climate change and the potential for it to play out than we do almost anything else. If we knew as much about the digital economy as we do about climate change, I would be a billionaire by the end of the week. And if we know that much about something, why aren't we putting that to more strategic use? To your point, Ben, I mean, we have some real assets in the context of the UK and the network that the UK through the Met Office and others have internationally with NASA, with a number of the people who make forecasts around climate change, which are becoming more sophisticated in their modeling. There's so much we could do with that, I think, in terms of long-term planning. And the benefits of that would not just be accrued to the Navy, I think they'd be accrued much more widely to society. So I can't comment on the degree to which you're already moving that direction, but I can't help but think there's a real asset base that could be tapped into and a real benefit that could be accrued by the Navy.
Andrea.
All right, I have 3 answers to your question, sir. You may recall a couple years ago, the wildfires in the Amazon, and it introduced a new question globally, which was climate sovereignty. This was a global asset that was now under threat by a nation state. So if you go back to kind of this notion of humanitarian intervention that rose in the 90s, there's a potential thought for this kind of climate intervention in the future for countries who own this. So that's kind of a state to state kind of level of tension. Another one, Shiloh mentioned kind of, I think there'll be a fracturing of governance in general. States are no longer necessarily going to have control of their full territories. And I take these lessons out of my humanitarian work. Increasingly, you're not just dealing with kind of a nation state when you go into country and you're working with a partner or an ally, you're working with the local government, you're working with informal groups, sometimes not necessarily friendly groups. And I think there's going to be a fracturing of governance in general for a lot of locations, especially ones that hit increased instability. And that'll be something that countries who are either donor countries or have national interests abroad are going to be increasingly concerned about and won't know necessarily who to work with, or it just makes that increasingly challenged. And then the what keeps me up at night is migration. I think it's the oldest form of adaptation to climate change. And to me, the most interesting piece is the kind of fundamental tension it has with democracy and our Western views on human rights. Mm-hmm. And as populations dramatically shift within countries, over and cross borders, what do we do with the volume of people that come in? Do you treat them like citizens? Do you give them equal rights? Do you let them vote? And I think those questions are really going to get stressed and strained over the next couple decades.
You said I didn't have to answer your question. I guess I'll just pick up on one thing. One thing you said this morning, which I think we'd all agree with, we're never very good at forecasting the future, but it actually sounds like this could be an area where we could be good at forecasting the future. The data is at a level of understanding that actually, as Matthew had said, perhaps we can do that work to work out exactly where the areas of greatest instability are going to be, and then prepare for that.
Charlotte's got a final point.
A lot more demand for operations at the lower end of the spectrum, and not enough consideration of what the scale of that is going to be and how that competes with the higher end demands and the tension between them.
Well, thanks, Shiloh. And it's great that the final word has come from a genuine expert on climate change. I found this a really stimulating discussion. And it clearly carries forward many implications, both for the Royal Navy and their maritime allies and partners, and in many respects to all of us. If I could just conclude on one note, for those of you for whom this topic is new, ISS recently produced a report on green defence, which is on our website. Now I can easily send you copies that specifically looked at the military implications of climate change for Europe. But would you join me in thanking our excellent panelists?